Anytime that we talk about a war in this class, we're going to be talking about the way that that war impacted government powers. So what we're going to see here is that both in the Union and the Confederacy, they both had to increase the power of the central government in order to run a successful war. They had to raise an army. They had to supply those armies. They had to finance or pay for the war. They also had to suppress any opposition. That meant people who were against their particular war effort. So in the Union, that would mean anybody who was supported the Confederacy, they had to keep them quiet. In the Confederacy, anybody who supported the Union, they had to keep them quiet. Um, so they basically had to keep that down. So in the Union, they are going to be focused on the Copperheads. The Copperheads are going to be Northern Democrats who wanted peace with the South. And we're going to see what has to happen in order to keep them quiet and not undermine the war effort during the Civil War. Raising the armies was really a challenge. The North did have an advantage simply because they had more people. That's really going to help them out because just numbers, when you have a percentage of a larger number, it's a larger number. So that's going to be really key. It was all volunteer based at first, but eventually they do have to turn to the draft. See, both sides, North and South alike, thought that this would be a 6-month war at best, and everybody wanted in on the action. Unfortunately, this war drug on for years. It went from 1861 to 1865. So those numbers dwindle, and both sides have to use the draft. There were riots that broke out because of the unfair practices that were used during the draft, specifically in the North. For example, in the North, you could pay a bounty to avoid serving your time. You could pay $300 to not go fight in this war. Only people that could afford that were the rich people. So the people who were left being drafted are going to be your regular old working average um, white American male. You could also hire a substitute to go fight in your place. So if you were drafted, again, if you had enough money, you could hire someone to fight in your place. Again, the only people that could afford that were the wealthy. So this is not only going to lead to people being angry over the draft practices, but it also led many of them to be angry at African Americans because African Americans weren't being drafted at this point. And many of these northern, your average working class white American males in the North felt like they were being discriminated against and that they were fighting for a cause that they didn't understand and were being unfairly targeted. The Union also had many advantages when it came to supplying their army as well. First of all, their industrial capacity. They had the factories in place that they could just retool to make all of the um, war materials that they needed. They also had the transportation capabilities. They basically had more miles of railroad. They had more wagons. They had better roads. All of this made it much easier to transport not only their troops but their supplies as well. They also had the financial centers. They had your big cities that had access to money in the banks. Remember, yes, the South had money, but most of those Southerners, their money, their liquid capital, their cash was all tied up in land and slaves. The North didn't really have that problem as much. So the North had a much better time, whereas the South faced a lot of problems. First of all, foraging the land was a big problem. The North, when those Union armies came through, they would basically take anything that they could use and just take anything of value as they marched through the South. That was a big problem. And the South faced shortage after shortage in all of their supplies and materials and food as well. So that's going to continue to be a problem for the South. When Abraham Lincoln first begins fighting this war, he was very clear on the purpose of the war. He said, I'm fighting this war to preserve the Union. This is why he was fighting. When the war began, he said nothing about slavery. He said, we are fighting to preserve the Union. In order to help fight this war, he will see both the North and the South restrict the civil rights and liberties of their citizens. For example, Abraham Lincoln is going to suspend the right of habeas corpus of many of those Copperheads. Remember those Southern Democrats who wanted peace with the South? we will see him suspend those rights. He is even going to basically throw them in jail, not charge them, just leave them sitting in jail just to prevent them from stirring up trouble. He is going to begin debating emancipation as the war drags on. One of the big reasons was because he needed a higher cause and a higher purpose for our soldiers fighting this war. They just needed a better reason to fight. It was much easier to fight for a cause like freeing of a people instead of fighting to preserve the Union. Freeing a people was just a much more tangible reason to fight. So eventually, after a long political fight, the Emancipation Proclamation is going to free slaves in the Confederacy. Now, you note there I have freed in quotation marks. That's because the Emancipation Proclamation it is worded to say that any slave in a territory that was in rebellion to the Union would be freed. Now, you have to remember there were several states who were still in the Union that owned slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation did nothing to free those slaves. It only, quote, freed the slaves who were in the Confederacy. Now remember, the South is not going to acknowledge this proclamation because they gave no power to President Lincoln. President Lincoln wasn't their president, so they were not going to run out to their fields and begin freeing their slaves. But what this is going to do is keep Great Britain out of the war. Remember, I told you that one of the things the South wanted was to get Europe on their side. Great Britain had long since abolished slavery, so they would certainly not join a country and fight for the Confederacy when they still had slaves for the moral issue, when it was clear that the Union was going to be eventually abolishing slavery. So this is going to serve several purposes, and it is going to be passed on January 1st, 1863. It was also hoped that in passing the Emancipation Proclamation that it's going to cause some panic in the South, that word would spread and that slaves would simply just walk off their plantations, which did happen in a lot of areas. And they were hoping that it would just cause a lot of chaos. So there was lots of purposes to the Emancipation Proclamation. But as far as it really doing anything officially, it really didn't actually free any slaves, but it had a very specific purpose in what it did do. African Americans are going to fight in the war. They were going to serve in segregated forces. You see here one of the most famous was the 54th Massachusetts. They were a black regiment that fought for the Union very bravely, very valiantly. And you eventually see that black soldiers were allowed eventually into the military and were allowed to fight in active combat situations. Because when they were first allowed in the military, they were only allowed to do manual labor. But eventually, they were allowed to actually fight. So again, don't think that just because it was the North that they were all equal. That wasn't the case. They still faced a lot of discrimination. Women also served in the war. They served as nurses. They also served as cooks, basically, again, non-combat related duties. Clara Barton becomes very famous after this. She was a nurse who goes on to found the Red Cross. When many soldiers, both who fought for the Union and the Confederacy, joined this war effort, they were convinced this would be a 6-month war. They wanted to have some of the glory of fighting in a war to come home with those war stories. It didn't take long, however, for that disillusionment to really set in, for them to see the reality of war, to see that, their friends and relatives were dying all around them. They served in filthy conditions, very, very poor conditions. Lice was very rampant. Rats ran all over the place. The men did not remain clean. They didn't bathe often. This is going to lead to disease spreading. They had very poor food. They survived off of hardtack and stale coffee. Hardtack is like a very hard cracker. Had no yeast in the bread, so imagine like a cracker, except in a lot of cases it was so hard that the men had to soak it in the coffee just to eat it. So very poor food, very poor nutrition, very bad medical care. They had very little. If a soldier required an amputation, there was no anesthesia. They basically just began amputating, sawing off those limbs while these men were conscious. There was no idea of cleanliness, so they were just kind of wiping off the tools and moving on to the next. Gangrene was a big problem. So, really bad medical care as well. And the prison camps were horrendous. One of the worst was going to be Andersonville. Andersonville was a Confederate prison camp. The picture you see here on the left is one of those who was in Andersonville. The soldiers were basically crammed in here. Way too many men, nowhere near enough supplies. So the conditions are going to be terrible. In fact, eventually, the Confederate general who was in charge of Andersonville is going to be executed for the treatment of those prisoners of war during the Civil War. So you see that there were just terrible conditions all the way around, and soldiers certainly, their lives were really terrible and were faced with a lot of terrible things during this war.